All right, good morning. My name is Paul Reeder, and I'm on staff at Great Valley Presbyterian Church, and I'm leading us in an 8-week study of the book of Exodus, specifically chapters 1 through 15. And this morning we're going to cover Exodus chapter 2. So if you're new, or even if you're here from last week, I'd encourage you, if you haven't read it yet, pause this for a second. Go read Exodus chapter 2, think about it, maybe think about some things that stuck out to you or questions you have, write those down, and then jump back on. With that said, I'm going to jump into Exodus chapter 2, and I'm going to lead us through the text. We're going to ask some questions. I'm going to break it up again into 4 different sections. So here is section 1, and we'll jump right in by actually reading the last verse from chapter 1. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." So last week we kind of left things at what seems like a pretty big down point. Pharaoh's tried 3 different attempts to get rid of God's people, to kind of limit their growth, to bring them under control. And this last attempt is kind of the no-holds-barred open warfare. Every son that is born to them, he says this to all the Egyptians. This is now a national thing. You cast into the Nile. The Nile is the place of life. It's the place where all of Egypt's commerce, their success is based on. In some ways, they worship the Nile. And so it's kind of a way of saying we're tossing these children to the Nile. It is going to lead to their destruction. At least that's Pharaoh's hope. And so that's where things end. And chapter 2, interestingly enough, starts this way. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. So notice here the emphasis on the house of Levi. And notice also just the kind of interesting story breaks. You go from really big picture, Pharaoh's doing this, the nation's struggling, to a real zoom in moment, right? The author wants us to look at something specific here, right? The specific Levite, who's one of Jacob's 12 sons, and this specific Levite woman, they come together and they get married. Verse 2, the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. So notice the detail on one hand. Like it's telling us they get married, they get pregnant, and they have a son. So once again, this idea of a son, the son is unusually important here, right? That's who Pharaoh specifically is after. He's after the sons. If we can eliminate the sons, we can eliminate this problem with these Israelites that keep growing. And specifically in this case, they bear a son. And notice what it says. It says that when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. We honestly don't really know what that means. It means, it literally says, when she saw that he was good. When she saw that, it could mean healthy, it could mean he was unusual looking and that he was beautiful. Some of the ancient commentators say it had to do with just he was unusually good looking. There was something there, though, that caused her, obviously, because she loves her son, not to immediately throw him into the Nile. So it says she hid him for 3 months. So that tells us that things are on the move in Egypt. The Egyptians are clamping down. They are taking this very seriously. They are attempting to kill the Israelite children. And this Levite mother, this Israelite mother, feels the need to hide him. And notice it talks about her hiding him, not the father. Talks about her hiding him for 3 months. Verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. So this is, once again, a pretty interesting callback to Genesis. The word here is literally she took an ark. Makes you think back of Noah. And what does she do with this ark? She covers it in pitch, just like Noah did with the ark. So the idea here is the story is being played out again. This child is placed in the ark, in this basket, and it's down by down by the Nile. So it's essentially, in some ways, she's complying with the order. She's putting it down by the Nile, but there's this expectation, not the child is thrown into the Nile to die, but precisely the opposite. Verse 4, this is where it gets really exciting. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So here's the introduction. It's funny, Moses, the rest of Moses' family is kind of left out. We're not told much about them at this point, but this is where we find out he has an older sister. And the older sister comes down to the water to kind of watch over him and literally see what's happening. Like, what's going to happen with his kids? And the expectation is something is going to happen. The expectation is not that this child's going to die, but something unusual is going to happen. Verse 5, now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. So notice, this is so exciting, right? It was not uncommon for royalty to come down to these specific places at the Nile River where they would ceremonially bathe. Once again, they see the Nile as a source of divine life, like almost a divinity in and of itself. This Nile, as we found out last chapter, is going to be the source, supposedly, of death for Israel. And in contrast, something cool is getting ready to happen at the Nile. It's not going to go the way Pharaoh thought it was going to go. In fact, his own daughter comes down, get this, Pharaoh's daughter comes down, begins bathing at the Nile, hears or sees something, sees this basket, sends one of her servants over to grab the basket. Verse 6, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. So this is really interesting, right? Pharaoh's daughter, who should be on board with everything that Pharaoh is doing, should see this child, should toss it out, should kill it, and instead something crazy happens, right? Pharaoh's own daughter sees this baby, has this moment where the baby's crying, and she recognizes who it is. She knows this is a Hebrew child, and she has compassion. She doesn't kill the child. Instead, quite the opposite happens. Verse 7, then his sisters, Moses' sisters, said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Moses' sister looks up and says, hey, I see what you're doing. Why don't I find someone to take this baby, to nurse it for you, to take care of this Hebrew child for you, right? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Moses' mom calls her. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. So get all this just happened. Get the great reversal. Get the irony of this passage. Because if you miss the irony and the strange turn of events, you kind of miss the whole point of the passage. Last chapter ended with Pharaoh choosing, specifically in a certain way, all the Egyptians killed these Hebrew children by throwing them in the Nile. That's how they are going to die. And get the irony of how this passage starts out. Down at the Nile, Hebrews are apparently being killed, being tossed into the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, sees this child. Her immediate response should be, kill it. Instead, she has compassion and essentially says, not only save the child's life, but I'm going to pay Moses' mom to nurse, care for, and raise him. That is the most incredible twist and turn of events. What is meant for evil, specifically in that way, specifically with the Nile, with how that child is supposed to die, is incredibly twisted and almost like a judo move, turned for good. You've got to hold on to that irony. Verse 10, when the child grew older, she, that's Moses' mom, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So get what's going on here. There's a great reversal. In the very place where death is meant to come to Hebrew children, instead, life is found. This child grows up under the care of his parents, right? He is raised by at least his mom. And then he's taken to Pharaoh's daughter, and notice the language here. He became her son. So that's formal adoption language. He is no longer treated as a Hebrew, but now he becomes part of the royal household. So Pharaoh's doing his best to slaughter and kill Hebrew children, and right under his nose, by his own daughter's work, despite the fact that this child was in the Nile, something crazy happens. He is rescued. And notice what it says. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So the word Moses has meanings both in Egyptian language. It actually means son. So like the words Tutmos, you hear Mos there, that sounds like Moses, or Ramses is actually, if you listen to the last consonants, it's MSS, so that's Moses. Those are actually both Egyptian names that have the word Moses in them that means son. So that's son of Ra, Ramses, or Tutmos, son of Tut. And so it has an Egyptian meaning there, but also has a Hebrew meaning. As it says, I drew him out of the water. Moses means drawn out. So there's an interesting wordplay that the author's picking up on that he wants us to pick up on also. So once again, in this first section, notice the irony. It's pretty cool. There's some neat stuff that the author is drawing us into see, and it makes us think there is a great reversal taking place in precisely the point at which evil should be coming to bear. Things are being turned on its head. Also notice, once again, the author wants us to see how specifically women are undermining Pharaoh at every effort. His every attempt to kill these children is thwarted. He has no power to kill God's people. And it's beginning to show a huge contrast between this Pharaoh who is treated as a god and someone else, some shadowy, powerful figure that's going to enter in more and more. So that's section 1. We'll come back in just a second for section 2. All right, let's start in the next section. I'm going to start reading in verse 11, and we're going to look at 11 to 15. Verse 11 starts, One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So this section, you can tell some time has passed, right? And it talks about one day. It's not a specific day, just kind of a day at random when Moses is no longer a child. He's been raised now in Pharaoh's household. The idea is he's an adult. But notice what it says, something really intriguing. He went out to his own people. So he has this deep-seated identity. He knows who he truly is. And he, in some way, is identifying. These are his own people. And he looked on their burdens, it says. So the idea here is they are in forced labor. They are slaves. And he is going out and he's taking it all in. This isn't just, hey, you happen to look out a window and he saw the Israelites out there. The idea is he has gone out. So he is out intentionally moving toward his people, intentionally engaging mentally, emotionally in what's going on to them. And he sees an Egyptian beating or striking, smiting one of his people. So notice the repetition there. The idea is that something is happening. Moses is choosing to remember to own his identity. It's repeated twice here. And notice what happened. This Egyptian is beating a Hebrew. So Moses looks out and says, hey, this guy is beating one of my own people. And the idea is not just he's being struck. The idea is potential death. Like this is a serious thing. Verse 12. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one. So notice Moses is doing this intentionally, and he's doing this in almost a dramatic fashion. He's looking this way and that. So he does not want this to be known. He is making a big move here, and he knows it. This is not an off-the-hand thing. This is not, oh, I had a fit of anger, and so I killed this guy. This is an intentional identification with his people, and he's making a move. He's going out to them. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So Moses intentionally kills this guy who is beating potentially going to kill one of his own people and hides the body. Moses is making a big move here. This is a guy taking feelings, thoughts, considerations, and putting them into action. Verse 13. When he went out the next day, so this is a day later, notice this word, behold, that means take notice. He sees two Hebrews struggling together. So these are two of his own people he identifies with. And he said to the man in the wrong. So there's a guy doing right and there's a guy in the wrong. The text makes that explicit. He says to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companions? This word strike is the same word for beating. So now he sees two of his own people, and one of them is beating up the other one. And the guy that's in the wrong, Moses addresses specifically him and says, why are you doing this? And there's a sense not, he's just asking the question of, oh, why'd you do that? But no, why are you beating your companion? The word there's actually in Hebrew, it's neighbor. Verse 14, he answered, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So the guy's retort is, you have no place here. Who are you not just to identify with us as Hebrews, but you're acting like a prince and judge over us. Is that something you're taking on yourself? So the implication here, and you do have to see what's going on, because a lot of ancient commentators have done a better job, I think, than picking up than the newer ones. But the implication is Moses is taking a position of judge and prince. He is moving to bring justice as a judge, as a prince, over the Hebrews. Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is no. So Moses has moved, in a sense, from this position of strength. I'm taking action. I'm going to set stuff right. I've been appointed as a judge. There's this idea that we need to see that Moses is, in his own self-identity, thinking of himself as someone that should move to bring justice, that should stop oppression, that should move to set things right. Not only relieving the oppression of his people, but setting things right with his people. And so the idea is Moses being raised up as a prince and a judge? And Moses suddenly realizes he has found out. This thing is known. The fact that he is taking a stand against Pharaoh, he's taking a stand for his people, that's going to become public. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So what's underlying the text that is easy to miss is this isn't just a spurt of anger that Moses gets angry and kills this guy, but no, Moses is actually inciting a rebellion of some sort. He is trying to get people motivated. He is trying to turn the tide of things. He, in some sense, is convinced he's supposed to lead these people. He is identifying with his people. He's owning their cause, and he's taking action. And then this thing kind of blows up in his face. His own people kind of are like, nah, who are you? Back off, bro. Who set you over us? What? And Pharaoh is trying to kill him. So basically, he is rejected by everybody. And it says, Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. So get the idea. The idea is Moses is trying to jump up, do something, carry out some sort of calling, bring justice, free the oppressed, bring justice not only from on top of his people, but into the midst of his people. And what does he receive? He receives rejection. So if you have a minute, you want to pause here, take a second and read Acts 7, verses 17 to 24 and beyond. It's Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin, and it's really interesting. Stephen adds perspectives because Stephen recognizes some of these things in these texts, and basically says Moses is trying to rise up and deliver his people, and his own people reject him. They reject their deliverer. And Moses compares that. Essentially part of Stephen's speech is to compare Jesus, rejected deliverer, to Moses, also rejected deliverer. So on that note, that'll end section 2, and then in just a second we'll pick up and do section 3. All right, well, section 2 ended with Moses, essentially his rejection and kind of his loss of identity everywhere, right? His own people have said, get lost. And apparently they turn him in some sense, to Pharaoh. Pharaoh finds out, tries to kill him. So Moses at this point has kind of lost everything. Like his status as an Egyptian's gone. His status as an Israelite, he is rejected by them. And what does he do? He takes off. He takes a hike. He goes to Midian. Midian is a country nearby, populated also by descendants of Abraham through another line, not through the line of Isaac, but they're kind of like extended family. And notice the last verse of the section says, Moses sat down by a well. Now, if you're familiar at all with Genesis, and even with the New Testament in some ways, cool things happen at wells. Whenever you see a well pop up, you're supposed to take note and say, hey, what's going on here? Especially when it's a single guy at a well. Hint, hint, go back and read Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. Things are found at wells. Often wives tend to show up at wells, or women in unusual circumstances who need to be delivered at times show up at wells. So there you go. Verse 16. Now the priest of Midian, notice he's a priest. This guy is a worshiper of God. It's always interesting to note that Israel does not have an exclusive relationship with God, whereby everyone else, and there's no other followers of God. The idea is that there are other people at and around this time, like Melchizedek and others, who are true followers of the true God, but are outside the scope of Israel. Something to think about. Now the priest of Midian, verse 16, had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. So it's a common thing in that day and age. Men often went out and did some of the heavy work, working out in the fields, working with the flocks, and oftentimes it was the job of the women to bring water up out of wells and bring water back home. In this case, looks like it's their job to water their father's flocks. Verse 17, shepherds came and drove them away. So opposition arises from other shepherds, other keepers of the flock. They drive the women away, and notice what happens. But Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. So the idea here, and it's going to repeat it again in just a second, is that Moses is a man of action, and he's a man of justice. He sees injustice happening, and he stands up and says, no, this will not happen. And notice the word, he saved them. That's a very specific word. It's Yeshua, to save, to deliver. It's going to become a common refrain. It's actually setting up things that are going to happen much later, both with David and in the New Testament. So hold on to that. Moses saves them. Verse 18, when they, that's the girls, came home to their father Reuel, he said, how is it that you've come home so soon today? So he's kind of like, man, you guys are super early. Normally you get back at this time. It takes you forever to do this. How are you home early? And they said, an Egyptian. So notice how they see Moses. Notice what Moses looks like. Notice their perception of him. An Egyptian, and there's this word again, delivered, different word for saves, delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock. So once again, I want to call attention. This chapter is giving us huge hints as that, in some sense, how Moses sees himself, but also how we are to begin to perceive Moses. God's doing something with this guy where he is a prince and a ruler over his Hebrew people, but also he is a deliverer and a savior. So they say, hey, Dad, this guy delivered us. Verse 20, and he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left him? Call the man that he may eat bread. This guy's done amazing stuff, and hospitality-wise, bring him home. We got to give this guy food. Verse 21, and Moses was content to dwell with the man. So Moses essentially sits at this well, trying to figure out what to do next, and this happens. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. So Moses not only meets this group of folks, finds hospitality, finds a place to live, finds a wife. Pretty cool, right? Verse 22, she gave birth to a son. And he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So things are beginning to take a very different turn and shape for Moses, but it's not all bad. God provides him with a a wife. God provides him with a place to live, an occupation, and more than that, he provides him with a son. And notice what he calls his son's name, Gershom. So the word Ger is for foreigner. It's a sojourner. It's a person who is not living at home. So catch this theme that's happening right now. Moses is being led so far away from the path that it seemed like he was supposed to take. And now even he says about himself, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And that's going to be a theme for all of Moses' life. Moses never actually has a home. He is a sojourner. Whether he is in Egypt, he's not at home. Whether he is in Midian, he's not at home. And even as we head into wilderness times, he's not at home. And he gets to the end of his life, and right before God's people enter the promised land, he is not at home. He is a sojourner in a foreign land. And that'll set us up for the last section in Exodus. All right, now we're going to start the last section. It's somewhat brief, and then we'll have a couple follow-up questions to think about and consider as we look forward to the discussion on Sunday. So once again, Sunday at 9 a.m., feel free to jump in on the Zoom call. We're going to discuss all of this as a group. So I'm going to read verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. So notice there's a break in the story here. We're shifting back to the big picture, shifting back to Israel, to these people who are enslaved. And notice it says many days. So this time that Moses is gone is not a short season. Other commentators, ancient, say it was probably 40 years. I think that's what Stephen says. So basically Moses is out in the wilderness for 40 years. He's keeping sheep. He's with this other people. He's with the Midianites. Life's completely changed. 40 years, that's a long time. During these many days, the king of Egypt died. So this old king who's trying to kill them, who's going after them, that old guy who tried to kill Moses, passed away. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. The word groaning there is they are oppressed and they feel it. They're groaning because of the slavery. And notice here, new term, they cried out. They cried out for help. So the idea is not specifically directed towards God, but more in a general sense, they are crying out. Some of that's praying, some of that's just they are seeking deliverance. This has become unbearable. They are seeking deliverance. They are crying out. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. So the idea is God is in heaven. He is enthroned in his throne room, different realm, cosmic, spiritual, but very real realm. God is enthroned, and in his throne room, he hears their cry. It rises up. Verse 24, this is critical. And God heard their groanings. Hold on to that first verb, heard. He hears their groanings. So God is paying attention the whole time. And God, second verb, remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God is aware, and God is considering the fact that he made promises. And when it says remembered, it's not like he forgot and then one day, oh yeah, I did make that promise. No, it's this idea that it's on his mind, and his remembering is going to move him to action. So I made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's in some sense like God is treating them as though they are still alive, which is really intriguing. Verse 25, God saw. So you got heard, remembered, saw the people of Israel. He sees them. He's not just taking notice, but he is actively engaged. And the last verb, and God knew. So the idea is that God is engaged, and it's this not just a passive knowledge, not an intellectual thing. This is God is fully engaged in what's going on. Everything up until now, there's been almost a passivity from God. Not that he's not working, but there's not this explicit action that's attributed to him. But so the idea is God is arousing himself to take explicit action. And that's how the chapter ends. So a couple things to think about, couple questions as we look to discuss this on Sunday. First, things to think about. One, do you expect God to work in unexpected ways, or is your God in a box? No one expected Pharaoh to act in certain ways, to try to kill the children this way. No one expected that God, through that very form of death that Pharaoh's bringing, through Pharaoh's strength and his action to kill these children at the Nile, through his own people, by drowning them, through that very act, those actions of evil, God works to bring about this incredible boy. God loves to bring irony. Why do I bring that up? Because it is through the very instrument of death that God allows Jesus to be glorified and allows our salvation. What was meant as a form of torture, death, what was meant to show that Jesus was a false Messiah, what was meant to show that sin and evil win the day, God does an amazing twist of events, and it's through that very cross, through the resurrection, it's actually proven that God's Messiah was meant to suffer to save his people. So notice the irony there. When have you not expected God to work in the expected ways? Do you expect the unexpected is kind of my question. Second, this brings about a big question about raising kids. Moses' parents, or at least his mom, she doesn't have very much time with them. Most commentators say it could have been 3 to 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter. But in that time, in that super critical time, they are being poured into. Moses' identity is established. God uses that, but it's also, in some ways, it's something for us to think about. How are we responsible, even at the very earliest ages, to raise up the next generation? And why do we bring that up? Because those years are critical. Those years are critical. We have an opportunity with young kids to pour into them, to establish identity. Proverbs even says, raise up a child in the way that he should go, and in the end, he will not depart from it. This only happens for Moses for a couple years, and look what happens. That's really cool. So what's your role right now in raising up the next generation? Third thing to consider. Oftentimes in Scripture, God's chosen deliverers are rejected. They must experience rejection before they essentially are led into doing what God calls them to do. We see that in the life of Moses. We see that hugely in the life of David. And then we see it again in the life of Jesus. We see it in God's people in Acts. They're often rejected. We see it in the life of Paul. Reject those very people that Jesus comes to deliver, that Paul comes to preach the gospel to, they often reject him. So, question for you, where are you experiencing rejection because you are following Jesus and telling about the gospel? Where are you experiencing that kind of rejection? Fourth thing to think about, here we see people suffering, and it's pretty clear both in the case of especially the people of Israel, we're going to talk about this more, they don't feel like God is with them. There's no sense of feeling like, oh yeah, I can suffer because God's with me. And it's actually interesting because their suffering, part of their suffering is, and this text brings it out, God doesn't seem like he's anywhere to be found. He's not explicitly brought out hardly at all. Like at one point he shows up and talks about these midwives fearing God, but God seems absent. So question for you, in your times of suffering, do you feel the presence of God? And if the answer is no, I want you to hear and think about and wrestle with the fact that that's okay. That may not mean that God is not with you, but it might be that just like Jesus, while he's on the cross, says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says that. Has God truly abandoned him forever and always? No, but does he feel that in that moment? Yes. And so question for you, have you ever felt rejected by God in the middle of suffering? Last thing, and this is just a short thing I want to add. It's clear in the last section that God hears and answers the cries of his people. So this last one is, when have you seen God answer your cries for deliverance, because God here shows up, and we're going to see him kind of explode onto the scene. We're going to see him rescue his people. But notice he's not in a hurry. He's not on our timetable. But at the same time, he does answer. So this is kind of an encouragement and a question. When have you seen God answer prayer? So that ends this section. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning. Feel free to jump in. If you have questions or things you want to talk about, feel free to email me, gpaulreeder, R-E-A-D-E-R, gpaulreeder@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you Sunday. Thanks. Bye.